All right, so I am going to give a little talk about Quickmock. I'll introduce it. I just wanted to start off with a little bit about myself. I have to turn off my speakers because I can hear myself in echo. I work at Workfront, which, as Z just said, we rebranded from @task. Really love my job. I don't really use a whole lot of these pieces or these tools at work, but I do use them on the side. This is my preferred, these are my tools of choice. So to give a brief synopsis of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about how testing is important, and then I'm going to talk about how testing is really painful, and then I'm going to talk about how I tried to simplify that process and make it a little less painful using this library called Quickmock, which basically you just write required mocks, then you call Quickmock, and it does all the injection for you, and then you can just get to the business of writing your tests. So testing is important. There's a lot of reasons for that. In order to write effective, performant, and reliable code, you need to have a good testing system that you can rely on so that you can make changes on the fly, run your test suite, and immediately deploy and not be afraid of where your code's going and what's going to happen, and hopefully customers don't yell at us, those kinds of fears that I've had a lot of my jobs. Thankfully at Workfront, we're pretty good about our front-end development, but historically front-end has been neglected. Server-side code gets tested a lot, tested pretty heavily, but then the front-end's kind of just a crapshoot, and hopefully it works. But Angular came along and made that a lot easier for us and gave us a system or a way to inject dependencies and do effective testing. In order to do, like I was saying, in order to have a good CI system or a continuous integration system, you need to have good testing so that you can build, test, and deploy in no time at all and not have to do a whole manual regression cycle. And that's what testing gives you. So if you are wanting more motivation on why you should be testing, Joe Eames gave a great talk back in September at this meetup called The Importance of TDD. It's on YouTube on our Meetups YouTube channel. I suggest everyone go back and watch it if you weren't there for that one. He went into a lot of specifics. He went into some details and examples, and then gave a great case of why we should put the time into learning how to test. By raise of hand, how many of you out there are using Angular on a day-to-day basis? Okay, how many of you are writing testing, unit testing for that code that you're writing? Okay, a much smaller raise of hands, and that's what I figured. Angular's pretty cool. Testing Angular is not so much fun. There's no awesome data binding magic in testing that just makes you go, yeah, I want to do this. So I'll go into some of the basics of testing here in a second. So here's an example. This is a service called MyService. It has one method called isAwesome, and it does some stuff and returns a Boolean value if indeed that thing is awesome or not. Can anybody tell me what the dependencies of this service are? Service A, B, and C. Thank you. All right, service A, service B, and service C. Okay, and if we want to test MyService, which is a simple unit that we can test, what do we need to do with these dependencies? Inject, mock them. Okay, we're going to inject the mocked versions of those dependencies. So why mocks? I'm going to dive into why mocks. So let's first, before we can explain why we need to use mocks, we need to hurry and briefly describe what a mock is. A mock is, I think, best described by looking at these two examples. So on the left, we have the actual implementation of a service A, which is one of the dependencies that we're going to have to mock out. And then on the right, we have the mocked version of that service. I didn't encapsulate all the logic in service A. I just gave some basic, that it has a dependency. It does some logic. You can imagine there's a bunch of code in there that does a whole bunch of important stuff. And then in the end, it either returns a valid true object or a valid false object, depending on some condition. Well, the mocked version of that test would have the exact same interface, but return just the bare minimum I need in order to make my code run with that injected mock. It has no dependencies, it has as little object as possible, which helps us to minimize potential bugs in our mock, but still returns the data we need. And I'll explain why we set up our mocks that way. I could give, well, anybody here could probably give a huge long presentation just on what a mock is, how to use it, why we use it. I'm going to try and encapsulate that really fast in a few minutes, but here we go. So here's a diagram depicting my service, which with its isAwesome method, and then the three dependencies that it has, and those methods that we're actually going to call within my service. So let's say we write our tests. We inject the actual implementations of these dependencies, like we've always been doing. All the tests are passing, things are great, and we keep running our CI system. And then one day, all of a sudden, we get a fail on the my service test. So we think, oh, a fail, crap, something's broken, which must mean we have a bug, right? There's a bug. There's a bug. Oh no, crap, what do we do? Okay, let's dive into my service and find it, right? Well, because we've used the actual implementations of service A, service B, and service C, we can't guarantee that the bug is indeed within my service. It could be in service A and it's just manifesting itself in my service, or it could be in service B, or it could be in service C. Who knows, right? It's just a big crapshoot. We're just gonna have to start diving through to figure out where the problem was. In theory, service A, service B, and service C are gonna have their own unit tests, and if the bug was in one of those three, that unit test should have failed as well. But it would be really nice to be able to run each of those unit tests independently of each other and have the bug that is in its code only manifested in that one spot. So in order to fix that, we, instead of injecting actual service A, we instead inject mock service A. And the same for service B and service C, which allows us, if we have any bugs in any of the other three services, we're only ever hitting the mocked versions of those services, so we know that that code is clean and good. So we can guarantee if a bug arises in my service, that's where it originated from. Does anybody have any questions about that synopsis so far? All right. Okay, so the next question is, okay, I kind of get what a mock is. I know I want to use it, but how do I write one? Well, there's a lot of cool tools out there to make mock writing a little easier, depending on which assertion framework you're using, either Jasmine or Mocha, or there's several others out there, JS Mockito or Quickmock. There's a bunch of different ones out there. Those tools provide different syntaxes for creating mocks, but they're all basically doing the same thing. In lieu of going into in-depth about how to write mocks, I'm going to direct you guys to this SitePoint article, and I'll post these slides on the YouTube channel and on the meetup afterwards, so you can go to this site and actually, he goes through in depth about how to write specific mocks for specific services in Angular, and it's pretty awesome. Any other questions? A lot of blank faces. Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Thumbs up? Okay, all right, awesome. Okay, so now once I've written a mock, assuming we went through tutorials and learned how to write mocks, how do I get them into my test? Well, as we all know, Angular has its own dependency injection. And because it's injecting dependencies for us, it can control what gets into your test, or what gets into your provider and what doesn't. And when I say provider, does everybody know what I mean? A provider is a service or a factory or a filter or a controller, any one of those Angular module level submodules, I guess you could call them. So it gives us this in a unit test, and maybe if any of you, how many of you have written unit tests in Jasmine before? That's pretty much what the Angular team recommends, and that's what all the examples on the Angular API docs show. If you've ever written a unit test, you've probably seen this $provide. And $provide allows you, instead of, so on this line, okay, on this line, right here where it says provide dot value service A. So basically what we're saying there is, okay, Angular, when you need to go inject service A, instead of injecting real service A that you already know about, how about you instead provide mock A in its place? So you do that for each of the dependencies. You get provide.value service A in place of mock A, and so on and so forth. I'm also creating spies here. You can see in the first one I created one with sign-on. The second one I created one with Jasmine, and the last one was just vanilla JS. This is just to show that this framework is independent of any specific mocking tools that you want to use. But anyway, we have to go through this kind of boilerplate in order to start writing tests because we have to provide the mocks to Angular. Okay, so that was cool for my service. It was a little bit of a pain. Thankfully, it only had 3 small dependencies that were pretty simplistic. So it only took us like, what, 8 or 9 lines there to provide all the mocks we needed. But what about, now we're going to go write my service 2 or some other service that also has dependencies on either service A or service B or service C or a combination of those. What are our options in order to inject those tests or those mocks into our next test? Well, the possible options are we can write our mocks the ngmock way. And who's familiar with ngmock? The built-in mocking module that Angular gives you. So they provide us with mocks for things like $HTTP, the log service, timeout, interval, things like that. That all comes with ngmock when you include it into your test suite. And what ngmock is doing is it's actually overwriting the actual implementations of all those things that it's mocking. So instead, Angular doesn't know the difference between the real version and the old version. It just grabs what it had latest, which will be the mocked version because you included ngmock as a dependency in your module. That's kind of cool because we didn't have to do any of that boilerplate at all. We just started writing tests and in came those mocks because Angular just grabbed those mocked versions because it doesn't know about the originals anymore. The problem, the con with that is it can be really easy if you're writing out a bunch of mocks as the overwritten ngmock method. It can be really easy to overwrite the provider you're trying to test with the mock version of it, and all of a sudden you're testing the mock itself for your provider instead of the provider. And it can be really hairy to try and keep all that maintained in your configuration setup of how you're injecting stuff or pulling stuff in for your either in Karma or in the Jasmine spec runner or however else you're executing your test suite. So it kind of gets a little hairy. Still thumbs up? Okay, all right. You should see what I see from up here. It's just, all right, okay. So step 2, or option 2, is we can try to fiddle around with the $provide, which I just showed you, and we can copy and paste those mocks from each test to test. We'll struggle around for a while, get really frustrated, and eventually give up. And try not to slit our wrists with all of this boilerplate that I just explained. Moving on, there we go. So the pros are, there's not a lot. It could be worse, it could be a lot worse. We could be like overwriting window dot something and trying to manage all that, but it's not that great. And there's a lot of cons, like I've just been explaining. It's just a lot of copying and pasting. If this interface for a certain service ever changes later, we have to go back into every place that we mocked that service and rewrite it and update it to match the new interface for our actual provider. So the third option, and there may be more, I haven't thought this totally through, but the third option I came up with was write all of our mocks in a separate regular standard Angular module, and then we'll inject them using a service called Quickmock, which is what I wrote. We'll talk about the pros, and I'm sure you'll find lots of cons, because haters gonna hate, right? Okay, so Quickmock to the rescue. Here is the link to GitHub if you guys want to follow along. There's a huge README on there with lots of documentation and explanation, but I'll go through some of the basics here. So writing the mocks, You'll see this is very familiar to you, except for some small minor differences. When you include Quickmock.js into your test suite, either through Karma or however else you're executing your tests, it gives you extra methods on the return value from Angular.module. So you can chain together things like mock service, or as you can see here on the right, there's mock service, mock factory, mock filter, mock controller, mock provider, mock value, mock constant, or even animations if you're mocking out those sorts of things. And this lets Angular know very specifically, like for this first example, this is the mock for service A. So when some provider that I'm trying to test needs service A, go and grab this instead. And then inside of those blocks, just like in any other service, you can declare your mock however you want. Whatever code you write in there will be returned and injected into your test. So you can see again in the first example, I used sign on to create a SPY object. In the second example, I used jasmine.createSPY_object, which is another way to create a mock. And in the third example, I just did vanilla.js again. So whatever I write in there, that's going to get returned. The idea is to keep those mocks really simple and clean so that there's no possibility for bugs. Write as little code as possible in order to make your test pass. Okay, so what's happening under the hood? Well, all I did when I wrote those mock service functions is I'm deferring to the regular .service call, but I'm prepending each of those declarations with triple underscore, which is just some predefined prefix, so that then when Quickmock goes to inject those things, it can relate the service you're looking for to its mocked version. And you can actually write out mocks this way in this other syntax, but it's kind of a little hairy. And you have to include those 3 underscores before everything you write. So I just wrote some syntactic sugar for it and called these mocked different mock methods. Does that make sense? More thumbs up? Okay, awesome, thank you. Appreciate the thumbs up. Okay, now let's get down and dirty. What's the API? What is this service really gonna do for me? Well, this is the same exact way we would start writing and set up our test for my service using Quickmock. So we hold on to one variable called myService, which is returned from a call to Quickmock. Quickmock accepts a config object here, like you can see, which I'll go into in just a second. That's all you have to do, and you can immediately start writing code for your tests. Just like you can see here, myService.isAwesome is the method that myService has. We can call it and expect stuff like we would in any other test. So what's all going on here? The first thing that we provide is the provider name, which is my service in this case. And again, a provider is a service, a factory controller, filter, etc. So we just provide that name to Quickmock. Then we provide the module name, which is the module that contains that provider, so that Quickmock can auto-instantiate that module for you, so you don't have to call module and pass in the name of your module on every test. And then the last thing is an optional thing. If we want to supply mocks to Quickmock, we just pass in an array of all the modules where our mocks reside. Pretty straightforward, 3 things, simple, quick, done. How do I use it? Well, once we do all of this stuff, that simple before each call to get Quickmock instantiated, then we can, then we can just start using it. I'll go into what this $mocks thing is here in a second, but basically we just do those 6 or 7 lines of code up at the top and before each, and we're ready to start writing code. So what is that $mocks thing? As you can see here in this kind of simple example, Angular already knows that we had 3 dependencies for my service, which was service A, service B, and service C. So when those get injected into your test, I grab references to those things in Quickmock and then provide them on the $mocks object on the service. So as you can see here, my service has a $mocks, which I'm saving off in mocks. And then that mocks object has references to service A, service B, and service C. and their applicable methods and whatever came back through in those mocks. Okay, awesome. Okay, that was a really simple, very, very simple service that we just kind of sort of tested and kind of got set up. Actually, we'd have to write a lot more it statements, but you get the idea. You could go write those yourself. Directives. How many of you love testing directives? Okay. I was just making sure everybody saw that I had my hand up because nobody raised their hand. Directives are notoriously hairy to test. And part of the reason for that is you have to do all of this boilerplate in order to set up your test. And there's slightly different ways you can actually write this code, but this is basically what you have to do. You have to instantiate the module that your directive is in. You have to provide all your mocks like you normally would. But then you have to call inject so that you can get access to root scope and compile. And then you have to save those off in variables in case you ever have to compile your directive again later. Then you have to supply some HTML string that's going to get compiled by angular.element, call Angular's $compile service with that element and any scope that you want it to use. And then call scope.digest because Angular has to know that those things occurred. How many, again, you don't like to write directives, but I've been bitten so many times by forgetting to call scope.digest when I make a change in my test, and Angular just thinks everything's the same, and I'm like, why isn't this working? Anyway, lots of opportunities for error and frustration here in this example. So again, back to Quickmock's simplistic version. We do the same three things where we provide the provider name, the module name, mock modules, which are the modules that contain our mocks, and then we pass in some default HTML. So the object that Quickmock passes back specifically for directives also has a $compile function. That $compile function compiles the HTML string and calls scope.digest for you, so you get all that bundled up in a single function call. 1 second. I'll get right there. This slide, in fact. So another thing that's passed back is the $element, which gives you access to that JQLite wrapped element or the jQuery version if you've already included that. Angular will use whichever is available. And then it also is passed back a $scope, which you can access here, as in this example, and do scope stuff on it and call digest yourself if you want to just update a scope value and you're good to go. And then you can do $element has class. It's all the JQLite methods that we come to know and love. So we can write our tests quickly and easily. Thank you for the question, though. Did that answer your question? All right. This is continuing directives. $compile. So here in this first example, we're just calling compile without passing anything into it. And it will default to use this HTML string that we've provided in the config object. But there are times where you want to change some attribute or something on your directive and then recompile it. Well, if you want to just do one-offs, you can actually pass in that HTML string to compile, and it will recompile that new string for you. And then later, if you don't pass in anything, it'll just go default back again to this same config object HTML. So it gives you a lot of flexibility about what I want to compile, when I want to compile it, when I want to do digests and things like that. So you can see here in this first expect statement, we're just expecting the HTML to be empty, the inner HTML of that element, because here we didn't pass in any content to it, and the template doesn't have any content to it either. But when we pass in some content in the center, we can do, in the second compile, we can then expect our element to have some content to it. So that's just to show that that works. Okay, any questions before I go into the live demo? All right, I saw 3 thumbs. I'm going to count it. All right. Let's jump into here. Okay, this is app.js. This is again on GitHub. This is a simple module that I wrote that contains different things that you would want to test. Here is an example of an API service. Here's a factory called user form validator. Here's another service. Here's a controller. Here's a directive. Here's a filter. And these actually have like real logic to them and real examples of what you'd want to test. And then over here, I don't know, it's really small. I don't know if you can read it, but over here we have different specs for each of those providers. So on GitHub, you can go through these examples and really see, okay, that example that you showed in your presentation was really small and simple, but what about real crap? Oh, this is the real crap you can actually test. But all I wanted to show simplistically here right at the end was that when I run all these tests, boom, they all passed. And then I'm using IntelliJ or WebStorm here. And you can see simply that each one of those test cases that I've written all passed in their individual pieces. And those are all written with Quickmock. If you're still not bought into how easy Quickmock is and you're still kind of like, I don't know, this is kind of a pain, I don't know if I want to use this, I've also provided examples of not using Quickmock to run those exact same test cases so you can see how much code you're actually cutting out of your tests by comparing those two suites back and forth. And going back, wrapping up. So I would like some help in contributing. I just this last week at Workfront started writing our first tests with Quickmock, but I think I'm pretty much the only one to ever put it through its tests or to its paces. So I'd really appreciate you guys pulling it down, trying some tests with it, see if you like it. If you run into bugs or have suggestions on how to make it better, please submit issues on the GitHub repo. I'd really appreciate that. Anybody else have any questions? Because I'm done. Like I just said, I actually finished writing this like 3 weeks ago. So it's brand new. It's very much in its infancy. We just started this week. I started using it in our production code to test some of our stuff. And I think we're going to start implementing it more. We're going to do kind of an internal presentation on how to use it and get our devs using it. But no, not to any large degree. So anybody else?